All right, final week of this class being just part of a much larger curriculum, but I want to bring back a quotation I used in week one, which I think is a very helpful, powerful quotation, which is to consider what is justice in relationship to love. And this Cornell West quotation, never forget that justice is what love looks like in public, I find to be a very touching quotation. And as you know, I've committed my second career to the world of spiritual intelligence, which is about the ability to behave with love, to behave with wisdom and compassion, while maintaining inner and outer peace. So that remains my North Star. What does love look like in public? We have talked when Tracy Brown was here in the fall about heartache in America and how do we fix heartache in America. And in a sense, it's very simple. The answer is we learn to love one another. If it were easy to do, we would have done it already. It's very hard work because other people are annoying. Let's just own that. And, I'm annoying to some people, other people are annoying to me. We're humans and we're in this messy, complex world and this messy, complex thing called a democracy. It's loud, it's difficult, and isn't that the spiritual growth opportunity? So here we are, learning how to love one another. We talked about heartache groups, and there are many of them. Today, we're going to focus on affirmative action as just one illustration from the book of Theories of Justice, but also one illustration of our situation in our country and what is our next evolution in this domain. But there are many arenas that need our attention and many heartache groups that are deserving of our care and concern. Race and ethnicity is a bigger topic, obviously, than just African American issues. It includes also Native American issues, which are very much worthy of our consideration as one of our original, one could say one of our original sins as this country, as to how we treated Native Americans. Another original sin, how we created this slavery mindset that perpetuates itself in our conversation about black and white in this country. So we have some deep things to worry about. We have additional issues that we have created over time with Japanese Americans, with other Asian Americans, with Latin Americans, and pretty much any other hyphenated American that is not European American. So I think there is some opportunity for growth. And as a European American, I want to think about what is mine to do, but I'm not interested in playing shame and blame. So it's like, how do we have this conversation in a way that is a loving, constructive conversation? So I promise that is the way in which I will hold today. Right? A loving, constructive conversation. Of course, we have gender issues to deal with that we won't get to today. The disabled or differently abled have their own set of issues, which we've been slowly making progress with. We have a tremendous amount of political polarization, in case you didn't notice that, that we might want to heal. And we have a lot of class issues. I think one of the least discussed but most powerful dynamics in our country right now is economic inequality. And so that's a contributing factor across all of these other variables. So at some point, worthy of conversation. So we'll hold all of this with love and see what the way forward might be. So today, this final class in this series is about trying to take the justice ideas we've been talking about in polarity theory and looking at some real world stuff. We're going to refresh just a tiny bit on the theories we've covered, like how does utilitarianism look at this, and libertarianism and John Rawls and Aristotle, but that's really not my focus today. My focus is, you've read that, we've talked about that, we're moving on to what's the real world stuff that we need to do. Quick reminder, we're talking about healing the heart of America. What do we mean by the word America? And these were the four things I started with, and I continue to find this a useful way to think about it. We are a geography. So we are a physical landmass that includes the states and territories that are known as the United States of America. We are a set of ideals and beliefs, and those are cherished by us, yet we don't always live into them. They're a beautiful North Star, but we in many cases have lived a lesser vision or not lived into the vision that we hold even for ourselves. But isn't that true in our personal lives as well? Yeah. So we can hold ourselves as Christians or as a different faith, and we can say, these are our ideals. This is the kind of person I want to be. But those ideals should be more than our daily lived behavior, or else they're not stretching us, right? So if I ever got to the point where I was totally living up to my current set of ideals, I'd want to set some new ones that pushed me further. So the fact that we don't live up to our ideals does not make the ideals wrong. It means we're still needing to stretch into living those ideals. So we are a process as a country. We are a work in progress. And the responsibility to continue the progress is not dependent on the soil we're standing on. This is not a geography problem. This is a humanity problem. Like, how do we as human beings keep making progress towards our ideals? And I'm actually really kind of excited that I think we're getting close to a big next step, and I will describe that as we go through today. So who is America? America is us. It's we the people. It's one of the most famous phrases in our collective consciousness. We the people of the United States of America. We the people. So we own this in terms of taking it to the next step. Now, the last couple of weeks we've touched on Maslow. Last week we talked about you doing your own exercise as homework first, and then we talked about it in class, and I showed you my homework around what's an ideal America look like if you consider it from each of these levels of Maslow's hierarchy, starting at the bottom where the survival or physiological issues are. What would I want? Like, if I were to create an ideal America for myself, my children, my grandchildren, unto the 7th generation, what would I want? And I might want to say, at the most basic level, that everyone has safe and sufficient food and water and shelter. Doesn't mean it has to be fabulous food and water. It just needs to be safe and sufficient, right? Doesn't have to be Fiji water, doesn't have to be 5-star meals, but I don't want anybody starving in this country. Like, that would be a core value for me. I don't want to see people starving here. What would safety look like? I would want all residents to feel safe. Inside this country, you should feel safe to go to your store. You should feel safe to walk to the school. You should feel safe. That would be a desire. I would want everyone to be free to love whom they want to love, and have groups kind of like Cheers that people can, everybody knows your name, and you show up, and you come to church on Sunday or whatever, and everybody hugs you. I would love that for everybody to have groups where they feel seen and loved and appreciated and treasured. I would want people to have self-esteem. I would want people to have access to learning. I would love to have people have access to the beauty of nature, parks, our beautiful national park system, to museums and music and creative expression, to self-actualization. I really love challenging merit-based systems to kind of help us force ourselves and challenge ourselves. So there is some great stuff out there inside our American consciousness. And as with any polarity, you can overdo any of this stuff. So yes, and. But having access to ladders of growth and development and ability to live the American dream as we conceive of it. And then self-transcending, having access to personal growth so that we can all mature across ego stages of development, develop spiritually, become the best selves we're capable of becoming in our lifetimes. So that was my more detailed version. This was the shorter one. I would like for people to feel able to live, to feel safe, to be loved and give love, to feel competent, to learn and grow, to create, be in the presence of beauty, to achieve and express their talents, and to grow up and serve the world. So that was just my homework assignment. Feel free to modify or steal as appropriate. All right. But it helps me to focus because this is the North Pole on the polarity map. It's why you bother reconciling the difficult polarities that we are faced with. Why put in the effort? It would be so much easier to just hang out in my preferred self-righteous space. Why should I even bother listening to you? Why should I care? And the reason I care is the North Pole, right? So that ideal Maslow is part of my North Pole. A simpler way of thinking about it is to think about surviving and thriving. Surviving is the first thing. If you don't do that, you're not going to thrive, right? So we got to survive. But then what does thriving look like? Okay. Now, last week, as a refresher, we had you do this really fun little dot exercise on the back wall, and I asked you 2 questions and to put your dot along the spectrum of how you felt. Are people basically trustworthy or untrustworthy or somewhere in the middle? That was question 1. Question 2, Is the world basically dangerous or neutral or friendly? This was your response to those two questions. So here, great bulk of energy was on people are trustworthy, and then a few in the middle and a couple over here. Now, what is the truth? Are people trustworthy or not? Yes. Right. And it's actually kind of an interesting, like probably most people are worthy of our trust, but there are a few who are not, and therefore it's worthy of paying attention to the signals and the context to see when is this person not worthy of my trust. It's part of us is to align with reality around the limitations of each person. And some people are not currently trustworthy because they're in some life condition that is kind of making them crazy. And maybe in another month or 2 or 3 years, they might be trustworthy again. So there's sort of a context sensitivity and being aware of reality that is part of the check going on here. Right, so are people trustworthy or not? Depends. It depends, yes and no. Probably a base assumption of this room is that most of the time, most people are trustworthy. But there's always a possibility that they're not. One of the interesting things that Barry Johnson's model around polarity management brings into focus is if a group is in complete agreement, you're at great risk. Because if this room said 100% everybody's trustworthy 100% of the time, what do you think is likely to happen? A startling confrontation with reality could be predicted. Right. So this is how I know of one situation where the church secretary ended up taking $30,000 out of the church bank account over the course of a few years. It's too much naivete, right? So it's like understanding reality and that we're all human and we all are imperfect and sometimes we're trustworthy and sometimes we're not. So Barry would say the underrepresented pole is worth paying extra attention to because it is your potential blind spot. All right, so the second question is the world a dangerous place or is the world a pretty safe place? And the bulk of the answers were over here, the world is a pretty safe place. Big bunch of people in the middle, though. Okay, so this is kind of a, yeah, both. Yeah, sometimes this way, sometimes not. And then a few people over here, the world's a pretty dangerous place. So all of that's true, isn't it? All of that could be true, context dependent. So it's sort of like don't be naive and just hang out in one space. In the embodied world, we have complexity. In the world of the absolute, things are simple. In the world of the absolute, everybody is Christ consciousness, everybody is a beautiful soul. In the world of our embodied reality, we're works in progress, we are not fully baked yet, and lots of things can be improved. So as you think about these, think about politics related to people who tend to be hawks and people who tend to be doves. In our political system, we use that language. Hawks are people who tend to be very defensive militarily. They want a really strong military. They tend to be looking suspiciously outward all the time, maybe even looking suspiciously inward. Where's the sabotage coming from? That position held exclusively could make you nuts, right? That position held exclusively could actually provoke the thing you fear, right? But also, if you only hang out over here with the everything's perfect la 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 land, you could be in trouble. Now, I don't want to misstate the position of doves. Doves actually tend not to be in la la land. They tend to have different perception about how to proceed. If there is a threat in the world, should we proceed through diplomacy? Should we just proceed through soft interventions as opposed to hard interventions? Soft interventions being things like economic sanctions, tariffs, different ways of intervening. So what is going to be best is going to be context dependent. And if you lock into either or, you're going to get the negative of a weak country. If your goal is a strong and healthy America, some appropriate mix of these and pulsing between these is going to be required. Does that make sense? Okay. So there's a theme here. Everybody's partially right. Everybody's partially wrong. I think I said on week 1, get used to it, you're not 100% right. There's plenty of opinions and they're not necessarily based on data. We have prejudged situations. that the real problem is that XYZ group is a bunch of slackers, or this particular person, don't we do this in families as well? This particular person is just a slacker. So we form a judgment, and then we have strong confirmation bias, and we want to see evidence of that, and we do not want to see evidence that disagrees with us. So it's a real challenge for us as we manage our own rider and elephant to get really more mature as a rider and be willing to actively seek out alternate perspectives and actual data. Now, data is always subject to error as well, because data gathering methodologies can be flawed, data interpretation methodologies can be flawed, but if there's no data, we're at 100% an opinion zone. So trying to move out of 100% opinion and into good policy requires that we get the best data that we can and always hold it with humility and keep improving on it. We have always been ignoring facts. We have always been ignoring facts. The more upset we get, the more facts we ignore. So we are extremely upset, therefore we are extremely ignoring of facts. And it may be the person who is most scared is the person who's doing the most ignoring. So what's the first solution? Is it to throw facts, or is it to help them feel less scared? Now, the data would say if you don't help them feel less scared, it does not matter what your facts are. And the only way to help people feel less scared is for them to start trusting you, which means you have to build relationships. So we just keep coming back to the challenge of love your neighbor, no matter how annoying they are. We talked about the goal of having a healthy family, and we talked about, do I take care of other people or do I take care of myself? And remember, we figured out that there is an upside to taking care of others and an upside of taking care of myself. But when I'm focused on either side, I tend to be blind to some of the other stuff. So if I'm focused, because I'm a good spiritual person, on taking care of other people, right? I'm going to tend to focus up here on the benefits of other care and see the downside of self-care, because I'll really fear being seen as selfish. Does that make sense? So I'll value having other people trust me and feeling loved. I will worry very much about being selfish, but I will be blind to the fact that my excessive focus on other care, if I only focus on that, will wear me out. I will get short-tempered, sick, and rupture the relationships I claim to care about. So this becomes a blind spot, and this is a blind spot. I don't see the benefit of self-care. And it's very easy to say, okay, Cindy, you're exhausted, go take a spa day, go take a vacation, you know. So I go to the spa, I spend an hour on the massage table, I start feeling guilty, I can't shut my brain up, I feel like I should be doing this and I should be doing that, and I'm all down in here thinking about this is selfish, blah, blah, blah. So instead of capturing the upside, I just ricochet back over here and start capturing the downside. This is a very normal human dynamic. Right? So whatever it is we overemphasize, we tend to capture the downside of that without knowing that we're doing it. It's our blind spot. So the answer is we have to pulse between them, like inhaling and exhaling. As soon as I'm dipping below the line on one side, I'm starting to be selfish, you know, whatever. You from here, you go back up there. From here, you go up over there. We also talked about parenting and being a good parent. Should you be tough or should you be tender? And the answer was yes, both, depending on the situation, the context, the moment, the child, right? So different children need different degrees of tough love. Some may need a whole bunch of it. Some may need very little of it. But calibrating to the situation is what's important. This tough versus tender is a very core American argument, and you will see it in politics time and again. You're making people weak is one of the criticisms of any intervention program by the government. So if people who are anti-intervention speak, you will often hear them speaking about what they hope for up here. We need to have strong, responsible citizens, and what they fear, you're making these people weak, dependent, and entitled. Is this starting to click a little bit? Yeah. If people are over here and they tend to prefer the nurturing pole, they're going to say, look, you guys need to demonstrate some empathy with other people's situations, you're just being an arrogant jerk by your refusal to see the real suffering of these other groups, right? So we need empathy, we need trust, people need to feel seen and loved, and they're very quick to see that this person is an oppositional bully. What they can't see so well is that their own pole can, in fact, when overused, have negative consequences, and they don't see the upside of appropriate challenge. If we don't resolve this pole, we will keep having this argument. And when I say resolve it, there's no like find the middle and stay there. Like with inhaling and exhaling, it's not half lungs full. It's about seeing this differently. Not as you versus me, and either tough is going to win or tender is going to win, but we want to win by accomplishing the North Pole, which means we have to have appropriate sensing of when we've stayed on one side too long. And you may remember I showed you the one that had the 2 additional squares on each side, so 4 additional squares. What are the warning signs that you've been here too long? What are the warning signs when you've been here too long? What are the action steps to be more tender? What are the action steps when you need to be more tough? When you get extreme polarization, you get the negative of both sides and the positive of neither. Right? Because you're slamming hard one side and then you slam hard the other side, and you're not constructively engaging with each other for the sake of the North Pole. Now, when we talked about children, co-parenting can be a very difficult deal. Oftentimes, one parent is advocating the tender pole while the other parent is advocating the tough pole. They're each trying to save the child from the evil of the other philosophy, right? It can destroy marriages, this conversation. How, instead of destroying the marriage, can we build a stronger marriage with our commitment to the North Pole, which is a strong and healthy adult, raise this child to be a strong and healthy adult? How can we have a strong and healthy America is kind of the same conversation. And the tough, tender pole is very much at play right now in our country. We talked last week about the social contract. The core question is one that we should all ask ourselves. What do we owe each other? Do I owe you anything? Now, how's your elephant feeling when I ask you that question? Do I owe you anything? What's your answer? Yes and no. But there's some kind of sense of, like, there's an expectation there that maybe we owe each other something. And that's really what Michael J. Sandel is pointing to, that this is a deeply held intuitive response in the human species, that we owe each other something. Now, the nature of what we owe each other is subject to conversation and debate, and each of us has to come to our own philosophy about it. But this sort of gut intuition, this is when maybe the elephant knows something important. The elephant knows, I do owe you something, even if it's just your liberty and your freedom to make your own choices. Maybe I just owe you respect, but I owe you something. And if I saw you suffering, then the next level question arises, do I owe you help? And what help would be helpful? Is it tough love or tender love that would be helpful? What do I owe you? And so this question sometimes is easier to look at first as a family. And we're going to spend a minute doing an exercise coming up on family. What does family dysfunctionally and functionally look like, and what do we owe each other inside the family? And then we can expand it to a healthy nation as to what do we owe each other. One of the big debates in the Justice book has been between the concept of individual freedom and individual rights and collective responsibility, or sort of the we, what the we choose. Now, the utilitarians tended to focus on the collective happiness, which was a math problem, right? And so we're going to somehow figure out, you get this many brownie points for this and this many points for that, and it's worth this many dollars for this and this many dollars for that. And so we're going to sort of work out the maximum happiness for the maximum people, which might be too bad for you, Mindy, because maybe nothing that you care about worked out in the equation. And the greater good is going to be served by, we're going to let you suffer, but the math works out that way, sorry. That's kind of the utilitarian argument. Now, the individual rights argument says, heck no, Mindy matters. As an individual, Mindy matters. We don't get to wipe her off just because the math works out, right? We have to take care of Mindy, and her rights come first. And that's the libertarian argument. Her rights come first. I don't have much collective responsibility to you other than not to infringe on your rights. That was the libertarian argument. Then we get into a more complex argument with John Rawls, where yes, rights come first, but there is some kind of a sense of social responsibility. And it gets much more nuanced and complex in his argument. But this is a debate that you will hear a lot going on in the political body, in the polis, in our democracy. Whose responsibility is it to fix a problem? And when we look at affirmative action, which is coming up as a topic today, this will also be a conversation at play. Who is responsible for the solution? But there's a sense in which we do family poorly, and there's a sense in which we do family well. When we do family well, let me ask you a few questions. Can you imagine that when we do family well, every family member is healthy? So that would be kind of an ideal, that every family member would be healthy. Every family member would be heard, and their needs would be factored into the whole, right? Is it possible that a family member's needs could be, one person's needs could be quite large compared to other people in the family? Yeah, and then that can create some tension because disproportionate resources and time and attention can be going to one person because that person's needs are high. But yet, is there some sense that a good family takes care of its weakest member? So, just it's interesting to notice the ideals that we hold for family, and will they transfer as we go to larger and larger groups? What makes America strong? I had a few things I added just to make sure we covered them. Our economy and capitalism, although capitalism is certainly an imperfect thing, is an engine of economic success for us and has helped to elevate a lot of people out of poverty. So it needs improvement, but taking care of the economy is pretty important. If our economy was collapsed, we would be weaker. So you can think of it in the reverse as well. Our defense and our military keeps us strong. If we didn't have one, I don't think we would enjoy the freedoms that we have. So while it can make some of us uncomfortable to think about, I think it's an important reality. Having the right number of people, massive overpopulation could make us weak. Do you agree? Massive underpopulation could make us weak. I have no idea what the right number is, but it just occurred to me I should mention that. Other things to confuse you with. Oh, my head doesn't hurt enough already. All right. Educating people. How we should educate them, in what we should educate them. Certainly, if we want our democratic republic to work, civics is a requirement. And I think part of the 2x4 up the side of the head we're getting right now is we have become lazy. And so what does an engaged citizen really look like? And so educated, committed, engaged citizenship matters. Physical health. If we were all poisoned, if all of our water systems were poisoned and we all got sick, would we be a strong country? No. So physical health matters, taking care of our physical health. Taking care of our infrastructure matters. If we can't provide water, if we can't take care of hygiene needs, if we can't take care of transportation. Some of you may remember the interstate highway system was actually driven by a concern around national defense, that we could not mobilize our military to move from state to state without a decent highway system. So it was actually a military consideration, a security consideration that first created our highway system. Taking care of our electricity grid, all of these things. Having good, resilient systems, being safe from things we used to not have to think about, like cyber attacks. Having a goodwill bank account, something I like to think about. Trust in relationships. Who will you go the extra mile for? I will go the extra mile for people I have existing high trust relationships for. And if you call me up and say, I can't explain it, but I need you to drop everything and come now, and I know you, and I know that if you're asking me that, I need to be there, I will drop everything and come now. So do we have allies that feel that way about us? Do we have goodwill bank accounts? The courage to face reality. This stinks, right? Not only am I not right about everything, but there's facts I don't want to look at, and you're going to make me look at them. Yuck, right? But if we are avoidant of the truths we need to see, we weaken ourselves. So to me, it's actually like a national security issue that we grow up and face reality. There's hard stuff inside this country, there's hard stuff to look at outside this country. Are we willing to do the grown up thing and look at it? And do I have to turn on the news again? I will tell you, my news strategy these days is to read it, not watch it, because the emotionality and the meanness on some of these TV shows is just too much. So long form journalism, longer articles, more in-depth analyses are going to be preferable in general if you want to stay informed. Having the humility to know that we need to listen and learn. We need to be courageous and we need to be humble. And that's really a polarity to be managed. It's one that requires us to act in the face of uncertainty. I'm never going to have all the data, but if I feel I need to act, to vote, to engage in the political process, I need to have the courage to do that, while also staying humble and open to the fact that I might be full of it and I might be wrong. So it's like holding both of those. And there's many others, and you have named many others. But I wanted to put this in our minds because that's the goal in healing the heart of America is we don't want to heal the heart of America and make us weak, right? We want to heal the heart of America in a way that keeps us strong. Here's our journey. Our journey is to grow up, to become more mature as human beings, to live into our fullest selves. And that means we have to learn to hold multiple perspectives, and that is not comfortable. So the definition of ego development and ego maturity of every school of thought I have looked at includes the ability to hold multiple perspectives. We have to learn to do it. We also need to be less attached to our sense of identity that I am my beliefs. If I think I am a Democrat and you are a Republican, I have just set up a conflict because of our identities. If I say, I hold some conservative beliefs, I hold some libertarian beliefs, I hold some liberal beliefs, and they're all open to interrogation, now we can be friends, right? So that's a much more mature posture. It is far more difficult to hold that, but it's a much more mature posture. We also need to, from a spiritual intelligence standpoint or spiritual growth standpoint, learn to be more than just our ego and have this connection to our highest nature, whatever you call that. The part of us that can observe the ego doing its craziness and pat it on the head and say, I love you. Now go to timeout because you're really not behaving well right now. I'll take over. Thank you very much. And, the ability to focus more broadly, the me versus you dynamic is the one that we are most easily trapped into right now in our polarized conversations. Am I right or are you right? And that's the worst place to be. The more that we can see the sometimes and the nuance, sometimes I'm right, sometimes you're right, sometimes neither one of us is right. Sometimes we need to take care of me, sometimes we need to take care of you, sometimes we need to take care of the collective whole and do what's the best for the greater good. Sometimes we need to look beyond the borders of the United States and think about what's good for the greater world and not just for the United States of America. So being able to transcend our small selves, a big part of all this. All right, I want to move into our final phase today, and I want to talk about the chapter I asked you guys to read. We're going to scene set a little bit by reminding us of some of our most cherished documents. We hold this Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States as very precious documents, as we should. And this is from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, given the time frame, they said men. Given the time frame, men meant white male property holders. We are a work in progress, all right? But if we expand this to say humanity, like we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all humans are created equal, I think we can all get on board with that, right? Right? So this is the unfolding truth of the best self of America. All humans are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, which include not limited to, but include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The preamble to the Constitution, very powerful paragraph. We, the people of the United States, that's us. It's almost goosebumpy to say that, isn't it? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Wow, another goosebump moment. Like we are this family that's trying to become a little more functional, a little more perfect, knowing that we're not perfect. And there's historical meaning to that, but there's also a larger meaning to what that means. So how do we do this thing that we call the United States of America? Become a more perfect union. Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Beautiful goals, right? This is a North Pole for us. On a polarity map, this is a North Pole. This is where we can find reconciliation across political parties. If we are still cherishing these documents, we can all be passionately patriotic and care deeply about the future of this country, even though we may then dispute which pole should be at play at any point in time, but we don't have to make that an either-or conversation. Is this a time for tough or is this a time for tender? It's going to be both at some point in time. So, all right, so let's get into the very touchy topic, but we need to go there, of race and affirmative action. It's important because I think there is no healing for this country until we're willing to look at our shadows. And this is one of our shadows that I think we need to look at. Is race real? I think that's a really important conversation, and there's multiple answers to the question. The first answer is no. Biologically, race is not a real thing. It's a story we made up. We are all Homo sapiens. There is no significant genetic differential. There is no significant capacity differential. Any stories that have been told in that domain were manufactured to serve a purpose. Okay, so I'm going to take a firm stand, and I think most scientists would. Race is not a biological reality. Okay, so we're starting from there. Now, is race real historically? Is race real culturally? And is race real in our psyches? Unfortunately, yes. And this is our work. So, yes, we created the concept, and it was created during the slave trade and exacerbated during the slave trade for reasons that I'll touch on briefly. Culturally, it has become embedded, and we're working against it. And I will show you the history of what I think is really some pretty remarkable progress. And we've got a long way to go. So it's a cultural reality that we're still dealing with. And it's psychological reality, and it's one that implicit bias tests show us even the most good-hearted, progressive egalitarians have 75 or more % chance of carrying implicit bias. All right, and that's regardless of the color of your skin. So we have been enculturated in this system to be biased towards whiteness. It just is the stew we're in. And that's the challenge to help fix. How do we deal with this? It helps for me to be real specific and own that personal behaviors can be a different thing. Like I would never want to be consciously, intentionally hurtful to any person because of their race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, pick it. Now, could I accidentally say something? Of course. Ignorance is always present, and I could say something that's offensive without knowing I said it. But my intention would be to never be consciously hurtful. That does not mean that I don't carry unintended, unconscious, implicit bias. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's a really helpful and important distinction because it's not about playing shame and blame. It's about saying you grew up in a culture that sort of put that in your psyche. How do we get it out? No blame, just how do we get it out? And then systemic inequalities, looking at the truth that over history, there have been systems, laws, and other practices in place that discriminated. And that bias can continue on autopilot until it is disrupted. So something has to happen to disrupt the autopilot. In addition, there are people who still try to actively suppress voting rights. So the reality is not, it's not all just autopilot. There are still some people who are working against equal voting rights, and we got to face reality and deal with that when that happens. So those are my positions on this. Let's do a quick history of the US relative to race. Slavery has existed throughout history. Any conquering country or nation or empire would take over another country and frequently would enslave their people. So enslavement was a power thing and an ownership. We beat you, so now we own your people. It wasn't, it was not initially burdened with baggage around specific religion or race. It was just who owned whom had to do with who won the battle. We won the battle, we now own you. You are now our slaves. During the European colonial era, a lot of things started to change around the world, and the expansion into the Americas provided a tremendous opportunity for wealth to be developed. In certain parts of Central and South, mostly Central America, there was a lot of gold and silver mining, and that could be extracted. But for a lot of the rest of North America, Central America, and the islands of the Caribbean, agriculture was a big deal. And so farming became really important. Now, I don't claim to be an expert in this topic, but I do try to read responsibly. So in my research, my kind of humorous head-shaking moment occurred when I read recently that they really did try to enslave Native Americans, but they were just crappy slaves. They kept running away, and they knew where to go, all right, because they knew the country and how to survive on their own. If they escaped successfully, and you never saw them again. Goodbye, gone. Plus, they really didn't understand agriculture and were kind of hard to train. So there were some things, and you're free to research all this, of course, but I do try to go to reliable sources that, pretty quickly it was abandoned as a concept that we're going to just take Native Americans as slaves. Doesn't mean they didn't try, okay? But it just didn't really work out. So how do you provide labor for these plantations and for these farms? Initially, there were a lot of indentured servants that were brought over from Europe because Europe had a tremendous economic crisis going on. A lot of people couldn't find employment, so they would indenture themselves for a period of years to work for a farmer. They basically sold themselves into a committed work relationship from which they could not escape, so they were indentured until that was paid off. In the beginning, a lot of them died before the payoff happened. As living conditions in the United States improved, or the colonies improved, they lived longer and would actually survive their indentured period, and become poor whites, maybe or maybe not owning property. At the same time, African slaves are coming over, and they're coming over as what is referred to as chattel slaves. Now, if you don't know that phrase, what it means is they were treated as livestock. Okay? You are owned completely. You do not have any rights not allowed to you by whoever owns you. And you can be sold and traded, and your children can be sold and traded, and you may or may not be allowed to marry. It was all pretty awful. It started out awful and got worse. So it started out awful and then went downhill as two things started happening. Indentured servants became less and less available because the economy in Europe improved. And what they found is that these sort of poor white class that was created as indentured servants survived their indenture period. They had been, when they were working the fields side by side with African slaves, intermarried, really been pals. There was just no sense of bias between them. And what happened with something called the Bacon Rebellion, and you'll have to look it up to get the details, was a fellow, Nathaniel Bacon, I believe his name was, and a group of poor whites rebelled against some of the powers that be in the center of Virginia, in the power center of Virginia, and promised black slaves, if you join us, we'll take care of you. So there was this alliance that occurred between poor whites and black slaves, which scared the poo-poo out of the people in control. When that really terrified the center of power, a news story emerged over time, which was, we need a way to treat poor white people so they won't associate with the black people anymore. So poor white people were often put in roles as slave master and told the story that you are superior to these people. And so the story of the inferiority of the black race exacerbated during that period of time, and laws against intermarriage appeared. So the general philosophy is that the really intensification of how awful this was occurred as a desire to keep poor whites separate from blacks. Now, history is a moving thing, and we may discover a better interpretation of history down the road, but that's the generally accepted current interpretation of how we kind of got to this place of somehow poor whites feeling alienated from poor blacks. And so even when slavery is ended in 1960, with the completion of the Civil War, you have the Emancipation Proclamation, but that doesn't change anything really until the Civil War ends. In 1865, what you have now is three groups: rich whites, poor whites, and black people. And you have the beginning in 1865 of the next era. Okay, maybe people aren't slaves, but how else can we keep them under control and sort of in their place? And you have this horrible era of the Jim Crow laws, which ends in 1965, ends, I'll put double quotes around that. In the 1960s, we have the Civil Rights era, and we have 1964, I believe, the Civil Rights Act, we have the Voting Rights Act, we have different things happening from the federal level to try and say, look, this problem that is continuing is not okay. Having blacks having to ride in the back of the bus, the Rosa Parks story, a million different forms of segregation and discrimination, not okay. And so the laws change, yay, and some things really do improve. And I want to talk about affirmative action and my own experience as a human resources person with affirmative action and equal opportunity, and what I think that did. But what we then had begin, and it took a while for us to see what was happening, is what has now been referred to as the new Jim Crow. Nixon passed the war on drugs legislation, and additional laws came along to kind of take a very firm stance on drugs. And this gets heated and super complicated. So I ask you to just take my word for it, go research it. There's a book called The New Jim Crow. You can research it for yourself. But there is a strongly held belief among many people, with a lot of data at this point seeming to support it, that differential enforcement on minority communities created differential burden in terms of how many people were going into the prison system and then coming out with felonies which would keep them from voting for the rest of their lives. It would also keep them from being able to find normal employment in many cases. So you have a new caste system being created through the new Jim Crow system. And that is a lot of what the current upwelling of concern is around black rights, is that we've developed it again. It's still there. Why do we keep doing this? Maybe it's not as blatant, but it's still very destructive. Another layer here is the privatization of prisons. Designed to help save money, it's actually created some very unfortunate reward loops, feedback loops of the best way for the prison to make money is to stay full. And so there have been documented cases of relationships with judges where people who might have been sent to probation or to other solutions of community service get sent to prison to help keep the prison full, and other forms of abuse taking place. There are unintended positive and negative consequences to almost any choice we make, and that's definitely a negative consequence to privatization. I believe that since 9/11, we've had this whole white nationalism tend to resurface in part around anti-Muslim sentiment. Can you all hear me okay? In part around anti-Muslim sentiment, but it's reactivating all of our shadow. And I personally believe this is actually a gift. This is a tremendous gift if we're willing and courageous enough to look at it. Don't avoid it. Don't engage in the easy, seductive polarization. And the way I think about this is the old style of working on social change was, these are my little dolls, right? These are gender neutral, race neutral, ethnic neutral, religion neutral dolls. um, they have red dots and blue dots, but don't go making a lot of political meaning out of that. It was the dots I had available. um, but, it could work for the Democrats and Republicans. But, the way we usually go at it is like it's a pull, tug of war. I'm going to win and drag you across the line, or you're going to win and drag me across the line. This is a really destructive long-term strategy. The strategy is to do this, right? Together, look at the problem. If they look at the music stand and that's the problem, and together we look at the problem, and we hold hands because we love each other, and we love our ideal America, and we say, okay, this is the problem, and this is true north up here. How are we going to work this problem to get to our ideal goal? Does that make sense? I think the new 1960s is upon us, but we're going to do it differently. And we're going to do it differently for lots of reasons, one of which is we're mature, right? At least a little bit more mature than we used to be, tiny bit more mature than we used to be. And I think intersectionality, which is a phrase that if you haven't heard is a really cool phrase to know, makes you sound very intelligent. Intersectionality is all the ways in which different people are out of equity in our system, right? So women don't have quite the same pay as men, right? People who are gay have some discrimination they deal with. People who are of color have discriminations they deal with. By the time you layer all this together, this becomes a really complex stew, and we will make ourselves crazy if we try to do everything this way, right? We got to join hands regardless and say, what's our true north? What's our ideal America? What will make us strong? And stand in our patriotism together because we all really love this country. That makes some sense? Here's a metaphor that I've come up with that I really, really like, which is a lot of times people say, I didn't create this problem. I wasn't here in the 1600s. My family maybe wasn't even here in the 1600s. I've never owned a slave. I don't treat people mean. Why is this my problem? Right? So here's the metaphor that I found helpful for me. Is like, what if you inherited a house and the basement was full of toxic mold? You didn't build the house. House has been around for centuries. But you suddenly realize this house, and we're all living in it, has mold in the basement. And we're all breathing the mold spores, all of us. Now you can say the privileged few can move to the higher floors, open the windows, buy fancy air filters, and maybe they will be minimally impacted. And the poor people can breathe the toxic mold because they can't afford the fancy filters. But is that really the way to run a society? Long term, even if you're nothing but a utilitarian, is that even going to work long term if you make everybody else sick and only a few people are healthy? But if you come at it from a moral standpoint, it's just wrong. So I didn't build the house and I didn't put the mold there. But do I want to deal with the mold? So yes, I want to get into the basement and bring that stuff to light and ventilate it and find a way to have a healthy house. So I think the arguments that people engage in, well, why is it my problem? It's because you live in the house. You didn't make the mold, you didn't build the house, but we live in this house together. So we got to ventilate the basement and be willing to put some sunshine down there and look at what we have been living with that we inherited. We didn't make it, we inherited it, but we can change it. We started week 1 with the nonviolent principles of MLK. We handed them out. They're available on the King Center website. Read them and read them and read them and read them. Nonviolent principles, crucial to making this social change. I think if we indulge in violence, we're going to sabotage ourselves. So I think the power of numbers and love and determination and ferocity of belief in our patriotic ideals will kick butt and get us there. It's going to be possibly a decade or more of effort, but I think we are entirely prepared and capable of doing it. We talked about polarity mapping by Barry Johnson, phenomenal tool. One of the things we learned is if you're down here in the negative of the too much tough, for example, and you're an advocate for tender and you're saying it's time to go up here, the first thing you're going to hit is a brick wall. The person who is advocating for tough will say no and heck no, I'm not going there. So the strategy for resistance is the opposite of your logic. Instead of talking about what's wrong with the excessive use of tough, skip it, at least skip it for a while. Focus on the North Pole. What do you have in common? What is your shared patriotic commitment, your shared commitment to your children? What is the upside of the pole that person already loves? What is it that they fear? What do they hope for? What do they fear? Come back up to the North Pole. Then say, can you see that it's possible that we could also do this while not losing the advantages here, while not going down here? But can you see that there might be something here? After you listen to people and validate their existing position, they're more likely to give you a little space to validate yours. Right? Then you come over here and say, well, yes, we'll absolutely make sure we keep doing these things, and remember our goal is up here. So it's a very powerful tool for changing how we talk to other people and how we build relationship. Barry Johnson then goes on to show the interlocking polarities. You thought this was complicated already? Look at this. So he says, not only am I a part of a family, so this is the part and the whole, I'm also a part of an organization, a part of a country, a part of humanity, a part of nature, a part of spirit, and spirit is the ultimate North Pole. Another way to think of it is, what if I love my neighbor and love myself while loving God by doing good in the world? And I think that's a good place to end. Thank you, everybody.